B'siyata d'shmai, we're going to learn Yoma Daf Mem Ches. We're going to start 14 lines from the bottom of Daf Mem Zayin Omid Beis. And the Gemara here starts with a siman, in brackets, Bein HaBeinaim, Poshat, Umochat, which others should say Umochak, Upizer, V'chishev, B'chafinas Chaveroi. Siman, this is a siman of some of the questions that Rav Papa is going to pose regarding the Meloi Chofnov, the cupped hands, the 2 hands full of Ktoires that the Kohen Gadol would take into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. There's going to be a number of questions, many asked by Rav Papa regarding this topic. It says the Gemara, Boyer Rav Papa. The first question, Bein HaBinaim. We discussed previously in the top of this Omid, in the previous share on Daf Mem Zayin Omid Beis at the top, that Bein HaBinaim shel Meloi Kumtzoi Mau, the flower between the fingers of the Kohen who's doing the Koimutz, what's its status? Does it have the status of Koimutz, which is inside the Koimutz, or does it have the status of Shirayim, the remnants, the leftovers of the Mincha? The question is, Bein HaBinaim shel Meloi Chofnov, this Kohen who's scooping up the 2 handsfuls of the Ktoires on Yom Kippur for the Kodesh HaKadoshim, Mahu, the parts of the Ktoires that are between his fingers, what's the halacha? So asks the Gemara, Mai komi boile, what was the question of Rav Papa? Are you asking Igomar Mole Meloi? Are you trying to ask, do we say Gzeir Shova Meloi from Ktoires? Mehosam from not from Ktoires, from Koimutz, from the regular Kmitza. If that your question, and by Kmitza you already discussed at the top of the Omid what the status is of the Bein HaBinaim by the Koimutz, is your whole question whether we learn Meloi Chofnov from Koimutz or not? Hainu hach. That's exactly the question we saw on Daf Mem Zayin Omid Aleph at the bottom, that there was a discussion there, whether we say Meloi or not. There's no reason to ask the question again here, because we saw before that from the same word bekumtzoi, what was the discussion there? That it says bekumtzoi, the koimutz has to be his koimutz, and we learned 2 halachas from there. One regarding whether it has to be done with his hands or can it be done with a kli, providing it's the same measure as the amount he would take with his hands. And there was another question whether it has to be exactly that means the amount that he has to have in his koimutz, how exact that has to be. And we learned that out also from bekumtzoi. Those were 2 halachas that we learned from there, that it has to be a full koimutz and it has to be with his hands and not with a utensil. So we asked by the Bein HaBinaim, by the koimutz, and the same will apply here by the Meloi Chofnov. If you say Meloi and you learn out the 2 halachas, then the same will apply by the koimutz, by the Ktoires of Yom Kippur as with the regular koimutz of a mincha. So what was the question of Rav Papa here? What new question have you got? Says the Gemara of Papa Hachiboya. This is what Rav Papa's question was. That even if you don't learn out Meloi, let's say you don't learn out Meloi, and the halachas of Meloi Chofnov are not learnt out from koimutz. And let's say that, and then there's a new question here, that even if you were to say that the bits between his fingers, let's say they are considered as part of what's supposed to be inside, part of what was then called koimutz, here it's going to be part of the Meloi Chofnov. But we have another issue here, that since it says in the Pasuk by the Meloi Chofnov that you have to take it v'lokach v'hevi, there's got to be an activity of a lokach, which means it has to be a conscious desire to take. So whatever's inside his hands, he's chosen to scoop up. Whatever's between his fingers is getting scooped up just by chance. He's not choosing to scoop it up. So maybe it's lacking in the velokach. And that's the question. Do we say the main thing is that you have Meloi Chofnov, that you have 2 handfuls of Ktoires, and you're bringing it into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and you've got that? Oidilmo, maybe not. Maybe velokach v'hevi ba'inon. You need a conscious desire, an act of taking it, v'holeka. and you haven't got that. Says the Gemara, Teiku, we have no way of resolving this question, it has to stand for now. Continues the Gemara, another question, Omer of Papa. And this is now a question regarding koimets of a regular mincha, not yet regarding the Malay Chofnov of Ketores on Yom Kippur. Omer of Papa, Pshitali, I'm taking it for granted that Malay Kumtzoi, that it has to be a full koimet, as we saw in Daf Mem Zayin on Medalef at the bottom, Kedekomtzi Inshi. Like we saw, it has to be in the way that people do a koimet, not just a little bit that you're taking with the tip, with your fingertips, a little bit of the flour. No, it's got to be a full, not over bulging, not sticking out, but a full 3 fingers of a hand. And Boyer of Papa asked as follows. So how would one normally do the koimet? As we said when we learnt the Gemara on Daf Mem Zayin earlier on, he puts his hand like vertically, so to speak, his fingers one on top of the other, and the little finger first going into the flour, and he then, with the flour now on the side of his palm, and he is now just closing his fingers onto his palm, and that's how he takes the 3 fingers, or that's how he takes the koimetz. However, what's the halacha? Beroshe etzba'osav. What happens if the palm of his hand is facing down? He puts his hand facing down into the flour, closes his finger onto the palm, and takes the koimetz that way. That's a question. Is that okay? Mao, is that mutter? Milamata lemalo. What happens if he's got his palm facing up and he puts his fingers into the flour? First the tips of his fingers, and then the rest of his hand, and then with his fingers he closes in onto his palm. His fingers are facing upwards now, and he's taking a koimetz that way. Is that okay? Min hatstadim mahu. What happens if he doesn't go into the flour, not with his fingers first, not facing down, not facing up? Rather, he just has his palm facing up, and he pushes his whole palm, that means the whole back of his hand, into the flour, allowing the flour to force its way between his fingers, and that way he's scooping up the koimetz. Is that okay? That's called minat stodim. It's coming from between his fingers. Ma'u, says the Gemara, Teiku, we do not know. We have to let that stand. Continues the Gemara, Omer of Papa. Rav Papa is now asking another list of questions, this time not on the koimetz of a mincha, rather the Malay Chofnov of the Ketores of Yom Kippurim. Pshitali, I'm taking it for granted that Malay Chofnov is Kedechofni Inshi. That a person has to take his cupped hands full in a normal way that a person would, by putting his 2 hands into the flour, not into the flour, into the Ketores, and scooping up together his 2 hands full. The Boyer of Papa is asking the similar questions that we asked by the koimetz a moment ago. Chofan baroshe etzba'osav ma'u. What happens if he fills up his 2 hands by putting his fingers into the flour, palm down? Milamato lemailo. If he puts his fingers into the ketores, not the flour, into the ketores, with his palm up, and that's how he fills his hands. Min hatzad mahu. If he does it like we said before, that he just forces the back of his hands into the ketores, forcing the ketores between his fingers. Chofan bezu, or if he scoops up with each hand independently, v'korvon ze'etzel zeh, and only then he draws the 2 hands next to each other, and that way he has Malay Chofnov. Ma'u, are any of these cases allowed? Says the Gemara, Teiku, we have to let that stand. Boyer of Papa, another question. Dov keila koimetz. We're back to koimetz of a mincha. We know the halacha is that you have to take the koimetz with your hands, as we saw before, malay kumtzoi. You have to then take the koimetz and put it into a klei shoris, and then it gets put onto the mizbeach. The question is, what happens if he took that koimetz, dovke, and he stuck it lekoimetz b'doifne demona? He stuck it onto the walls of this klei shoris. Mai, what's the halacha? Do we say toich kli ba'inon? The main thing is it's within the walls of the kli. V'ho'ikan it is. Oidilmo, no. Hanocha b'toichi ketiknoi ba'inon. You need it to settle, to be based, to be put into a vessel, into a utensil, that it should land on the base of the utensil, in which case, v'holeka, you haven't got that here. Teiku, here again, we do not have a any way of proving this. Continues the Gemara, Boya Marbar of Ashi. Of Chaylamona, what happens if you take a Klei Shoris, you turn it upside down, in the event that its base is also got a type of receptacle in it, and V'davke lekaimet bar isei demona, and you take the kaimet and you put it into the base, you put it onto the floor, the upside down kli, which is a type of a kli on its own, but it's not the normal way of doing it. Mao, what's the halacha? Hanocha b'soichei be'inon is the main thing that is placed within a receptacle v'ha'ika, and it is. Oidil more, no. Hanocha k'tikunei be'inon v'leka, you've got to put it into a klei shoros in the normal way that klei shoros is used. And it's not used upside down, normally it's used the right way around. Teiku, we have no way of resolving this. Continues the Gemara Boyer of Papa, Maloi Chofnov Sha'omru. This that we said, that you have to have your cupped hands, your 2 hands full of Ktoires for Yom Kippur and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, Mechukois, do they have to be leveled out, or Gedushois, or heaped? Omeler B'Abeler of Ashi, Toshima, will bring proof, says in the Braisa, Maloi Chofnov Sha'omru. This that it says in the Posuk, you need to have Maloi Chofnov, Loi Mechukois, not leveled, V'loi Gedushos, are not overflowing, heaped up, Elot Fufois, rather just floating a little bit. It should be rounded, it should have a little bit of extra over the top, but it should not be Gedushos, it shouldn't be heaped. Continues the Gemara, and this is an introduction to the next question. Tanan Asom, we learned in a Mishnah in Zvachim, Nishpech Hadom ala Ritzba. We know that to Nishech the Korban, then you have to do Kabbalah Sadam, you have to receive the blood in a Klei Shoris, it's called Kabbalah. What happens if the blood spilt from the neck of the animal, the throat of the animal, onto the floor of the Azara? V'osvu, and they collected it from the floor, posel, it's posel. You have to receive the blood directly from the animal. In a different Mishnah in Zvachim, it says, Min hakli ala ritzba, if it spills from the kli, that means you received the blood in the kli, and then after it was in the kli it spilt, v'osva, and they collected it up, kosher is kosher, and you can do the zrikas hadam. Menanamila, what would be the source for these halachas? The Tanu Rabbanon, this is a Gemara in Zvachim Daf Chofei, that the Pasuk says, V'lokach midam hapor. It says in the Pasuk there, V'lokach hakoyin ha-Moshiach midam hapor v'hevi oisoi el oihel moed. What does it mean, V'lokach midam hapor? Midam hapor means, number one, it's got to be midam hanefesh. It's got to be the blood which was the life force of this animal. V'loi midam ha'oir, and not the blood that came out from the skin when the first scratch was made by the shlita. V'loi midam hatamtis, and not from the remnants of the blood that comes out afterwards. No, it's got to be from the dam hanefesh. Another thing we learned from midam hapor, that dam me hapor yikablenu. It's as if you move the mem of midam to the before the hay of hapor, as if it says dam me hapor. You have to receive the blood straight from the animal. Yikablenu. The Yisrael Kedaitoch, because if you'd want to read it in the way it's written, midam hapor, as if to say part of the blood of the bull, of the par, midam, that would mean vafilu miktas dam, even just part of the blood, that cannot be true. Va'omar Rav Yehuda said, Hamikabel, the person who's receiving the blood, tzarich shekabel es kol damay shel par. Shenema, as it says in a different pasuk, ve'es kol dam hapar yishpoich el yisoid mizbach ha'ila. So you see clearly that you need all the blood. So what does it mean, mi dam hapar? Eloshma mino, it must mean my mi dam hapar. It must mean dam me hapar yekablenu, receive the blood directly from the animal. Or kosova, it must be, and we hold that goyrin, we can take away a letter from one word, or moisifin, and add it to another word, v'dorshin, and then we can learn the drasha, we can expound on the way this newly written words. So it says that dam me'apar, that's what we learn in halachos, that if the blood first fell on the floor and then you gathered it up, it's possible. However, if once you've collected the dam me'apar, it spills afterwards, it's okay. So that's what we know regarding regular Kabbalah Sadam of a korban. The question is, Boyer of Papa, Papa's question now is, what happens by the Ktoires? when this Kohen Gadol scoops up the Ketores, how do we parallel scooping up the Ketores in his hands? Are his hands now compared to the neck of the animal, or is it compared to the Kli Shoris? Nispazer HaKetores, what happens if the Ketores that he scooped up in his hands now gets scattered? It goes on the floor, it falls down, Mimaloi Chofno, from his full hands. And Mao, what's the halacha? And we have to remember that according to the letter of the law, we saw on Daf Mem Zayin that there's no explicit source in the Torah that you actually have to put the Ketores into a Kli. However, because we said EF, you have no other way of bringing the shovel of the coals with the Ketores into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, so you've got no choice, you've got to pour it into a Kli. But we have to keep in mind that Be'etzem, it's enough if it's in his hands. You don't need the Kli as part of the Avodah. And to the extent that we saw already before, we're going to see again later, that it could be you have to afterwards pour the Ketores from the spoon back into his hands, because they're supposed to be in his hands, and from his hands he's going to put it onto the coals to burn it in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So here you've got hands full of Ketores. Now, how do we look at that? Do we say Yodoi, that his hands are Ketzavar Behemodomi, that they're compared to the neck of an animal, and the blood has to go from it straight into the Kli, and if it gets scattered first on the floor or wherever, and then you regather it, Upsula, it'll be possible? Or Dilmo, no. Do we say that since you don't really need that Kli, the hands are Kli Shoris Dom, it's as if it's already been received? And once it's been received, it doesn't matter if it gets scattered. V'lo Upsula, it will not be possible. Says the Gemara Teiku, we do not have any way of resolving that. Boyer of Papa asks another question. Chishev, what happens if he had intentions, bechafinas Ketores, whilst he was scooping up the Ketores in his hands, where he was supposed to take it in order to bring it into the Kodesh HaKadoshim and burn it there as part of the Avodas Yom Kippurim, if whilst he was scooping up the Ketores, he had the intentions of burning the Ketores not that day on Yom Kippur, but the next day. Now, so of course you cannot burn it the next day. It's shaloi bizmanoi. The question is, even if he's going to burn it at the right time, the fact that he had the intentions of doing it shaloi bizmanoi is called a machsheves pigul. The question is there a concept of pigul at the time of chafinas Ketores? Mi omrinon, do we say yalif meloi mimincha, that we learn meloi of the Ketores, the meloi chofnov of Ketores from the Koimetz of the Mincha. And by Mincha we have an explicit pasuk that tells us that there is a concept of pigul when taking the Koimetz. So maybe here also we say that taking the Meloi Chofnov is the same as taking the Koimetz, and it's considered, and we say there is a concept of pigul. And over here the Gemara doesn't ask Meloi, you already asked that before, as the Gemara said before, at the bottom of Mem Zayin Amud Beis, Hainu Hach, it's already the question we had on Daf Mem Zayin Amud Aleph. No, because on Daf Mem Zayin Amud Aleph and on Mem Zayin Amud Beis, where we spoke about the Meloi, there it was talking about the concept of Bekumtzoi, that it's got to be a full koimetz, it's got to be with his koimetz, not with the utensil. There it was dependent on meloi. Here we're saying, let's say that we don't use meloi to say that, like it says bekumtzoi by the koimetz, is as if it says bechofnoi by the meloi chofnov. No, even without that. Just do we compare the two concepts? Maybe even if we don't say that it's as if it says bechofnoi, but we do say that the concepts of Ketores, of koimetz, and the concept of Ketores are compared to each other. That's how Rashi explains that here. So now, mi omrin on yalif meloi mimincha, ma hosam in the same way as kmitza mahanya ba machshava, that a machsheves pigul, a machsheves shlei bizmanoi is, it works, so to speak, to passel the mincha. Hochanami mahanya, and so to here by the chafina, by the meloi chofnov, mahanya ba machshava, also an inappropriate intention will make it possible. Or do we say no? We do not compare the Ketores at all, the Ketores and Kippur, the Melechofnov, to the Kometz, and there's no Machsheves Pigul by the Chafina when we scoop up the Ketores. That was the question of Rav Papa. Omer of Simi bar Ashi, the Rav Papa of Simi is going to prove it Tashema. We're going to prove it from a Mishnah in Idias. It says there, Hoisif Rabbi Akiva, regarding the kometz or the soiles, the fine flour, v'haktoires, or the ktoires that we're talking about now, v'alevoino, v'agecholim, or the coals, then all these four that we just mentioned, that they have the status of kedushas haguf, and therefore, she'em noga tvul yoim b'miktzason, posales kulon. We know that if a tvul yoim, who's somebody who was tomei, he went to mikveh and he's not yet waited till the end of the day, he's considered a tvul yoim. If he touches kodesh, he makes it posel. Over there, the Mishnah says that there's a chumrah by the kedushas haguf there, that if you have a utensil holding lots of ktoires, lots of coals, lots of levoino, lots of flour, even if the tvul yoim touches just one part of it, it's as if he touched every single particle contained in that utensil. That posal is kulon, the whole lot become posel. That's a chumrah of that with the kedushas haguf that applies to these four things. Kosol kadaitoch. So we would assume, says Rav Simi bar Ashi, that mida posal tvul yoim, since a tvul yoim makes these things posel, even if he touches just part, it makes the whole thing posel. That would seem that it's a kedushas haguf. How does it become a kedushas haguf? Because they've been placed in a kli shoris. And once it's been placed in a kli shoris, and it has kedushas haguf, then we know that posla nami lina. Then once it's been in a kli shoris, and it has kedushas haguf, the concept of lina applies, which means if it's left overnight, then the next day it's posel. Umida lina posla, and since if it were to be left overnight, it would be posel, posla nami machshova, then the intentions of doing it tomorrow is going to pass. It's called a machsheves chutz lizmanoi. And one of the things mentioned there, of Rabbi Akiva mentioned, is the ktoires. So you see that the ktoires has the status of kedushas haguf, and it is posel belina, and therefore it's posla nami machshova. That's how Rav Simi bar Ashi resolved Rav Papa's question. Continues the Gemara with another question. Boyer Rav Papa, Chishev b'chatias gecholim. What happens if he has this inappropriate intention of doing the ktoires shlei bizmanoi? And the Ritva actually says it's not only shlei bizmanoi, it's also shlei b'mkaimoi. But what happens if he does it not when he's doing the chafina, when he's scooping up the ktoires in his hands, rather when he's shoveling the coals on which he's going to burn the ktoires? Mao, do we say machshirei mitzvah kamitzvah, since these coals are the preparation and what allows us to do the mitzvah? It's got the same status as the mitzvah, and machsheves pigul applies to it, and it will be posel. According to the first pshat in Rashi, it will passel the whole ktoires. If one had in mind whilst shoveling the coals, the second pshat in Rashi says it will only passel those coals. But either way, is it kamitzvah dami oiloi, or do we say no, since the coals are not an intrinsic part of the ktoires, and therefore of the avodah, and therefore we do not say, that means the shoveling of the coals is not an intrinsic part of the avodah, and therefore there's no machsheves pigul? Teiku, the Gemara says, we do not have any way of resolving that. Boy menemer of Sheshus, to ask of Sheshus the following question. Hoilocha bismoil mao. This is the regular hoilochas hadam. We know that with every korban there's four main avodos: shlita, kabolas hadam, hoilochas hadam, taking the blood from the animal to the mizbeach, and zrikas hadam, throwing the blood on the mizbeach. What happens if the hoilocha is done, if whilst taking the blood to the mizbeach he does it with his left hand? Mao. What's the halacha? Omelur of Sheish, and Rashi says here that Kabbalas Hadam and Zrikas Hadam, we know 100% has to be done with the right hand. It's learnt out from Psukim. However, there's no explicit posuk regarding the Hailochas Hadam. What's the halacha? That's what they asked of Sheishes. Omelur of Sheishes says, I'll bring you proof from our Mishnah. Tenisua, from our Mishnah, we have proof. What does it say in the Mishnah? Not ales hamachto biyamino, he took the shovel of coals in his right hand, vesakaf bismoiloi, and the spoonful of ktoires, he took it with his left hand. So you see clearly that doing hailacha, taking an avodah with his left hand, is kosher. Says the Gemara, why are you bringing proof from the Ketores, which is not it's not a hailacha that's being done with an actual part of an animal, of the korban? Why don't you bring a better proof from Me'aditnan, from another Mishnah, when that Mishnah is talking about the actual hailacha of the actual parts of a korban? What do we see? We saw in the Mishnah that it says that haregel shel yamin bismoil, the person that with the lots that we learnt about, the one that was Zoicha b'Geirol, that he was going to carry the head and the right back foot of the animal to the mizbeach, then he takes the regel shel yamin, the right leg of the animal, bismoil, he holds it in his left hand. He holds the head in his right hand and the leg in his left hand. And the facing out, just so it should look more pleasant, is this where it's covered with skin, and where it's actually been cut off the animal is facing inwards. It's less visible. It's a more preferred way of carrying it that way. So you see clearly that you can do hailacha of the ivorim with the left hand. Says the Gemara, the reason that Rav Sheshes didn't prove from that Mishnah is ime hasam. From that Mishnah you can't bring proof. Have a minute, I would have thought. What are you doing with your hands? What hailacha are you doing? You're doing hailacha, taking the limbs, the parts of the animal, to the mizbeach. That's not ma'akav the kapara. It's not essential. Even if you don't put the limbs on the mizbeach, the person still gets atoned. So maybe over there, it doesn't matter if you do it with the left hand. But over here, where taking the Ketores to the Kodesh HaKadoshim is absolutely essential, maybe it's different. Komash Malon, that's why we bring proof from the Notales HaMachta, that in the same way as taking the Ketores is essential, so too taking the blood from a korban to the mizbeach, to Zrikas Hadam, is also essential, and therefore we prove from the Ketores to the dam that with hailacha, with the smile, is kosher. That was Rav Sheshes. However, we're going to ask a question on that Meisvei. What's the question? We learnt in a brisa that Zor, someone who's a non-Kohen, v'oinen, somebody who's one of his 7 close relatives died that day. Shikor, somebody who's drunk, u'bal mum, who's got a blemish, b'kabola, whether are any of these allowed to receive the blood, hailacha, take the blood to the mizbeach from the place where it was received, ubezrika, and to throw the blood onto the mizbeach, posel, these are all posel. V'chein yoshev, and so too somebody who's sitting was not allowed to do any avodah while sitting. V'chein smoil, and also doing it with the left hand. Posel is posel. So you see clearly in this brisa that doing hailacha with the left hand is posel. Tjufta, this seems to be a refutation against Rav Sheshes. The Rav Sheshes wanted to bring proof from our Mishnah that hailacha with the smoil is kosher. Asks the Gemara, you just refuted Rav Sheshes from this brisa? Rav Sheshes actually quoted this brisa to refute somebody else. Rav Sheshes asked the speaker, the one that was speaking the halachas of Rav Chizda, he asked this person, boy in the name of Rav Chizda, please go and ask Rav Chizda the following question. Hailacha bezor, if a non-kohen does hailacha, mau, what's the halacha? Omerle, his response was, Ksheira, it's kosher. Or Mikra Masayini, and he's even going to bring proof from a Pasuk. Because the Pasuk says in Divrei Yomim, Vayishchatu ha-Pesach, they shechted the korban Pesach, Vayizraku ha-Kohanim, and the Kohanim did the Zrika, miyadom, from their hands. Whose hands? They took the hands from somebody else, not from a Kohen, somebody else who after the Shechita, somebody else, a Zor, took the blood to the Kohanim, Vayizruku ha-Kohanim, and the Kohanim didn't do the hailacha, the Kohanim only did the Zrika. So Rav Chizda wanted to bring proof from this pasuk that Zor is kosher to do hailacha. And at the same time as that was happening, the Leviim were removing the skin of the animals. When Rav Sheshes heard this in the name of Rav Chizda, Rav Sheshes was the one that asked against this from the brisa we just mentioned. Zor v'oinon shikoy ubalmum bekabolo beilocho bezrika posel v'chein yeshu v'chein smoil posel. This very brisa that we just refuted Rav Sheshes with it, Rav Sheshes refuted Rav Chizda from it. Answers the Gemara, Bosa deshama hadar oisva. First, Rav Sheshes didn't know about this brisa, so he said that you can do hailocha b'smoil. They refuted Rav Sheshes by quoting this brisa. Now that Rav Sheshes was aware of this brisa, he then refuted Rav Chizda from this brisa. Asks the Gemara, Rav Chizda kralka omar. Okay, very good. You've got this brisa that a zor is not allowed to do hailacha, but you have a psukim. We mentioned this pasuk in Divrei Yomim that says vayishchatu apesach vayizerku akoyanim miyadam, that the koyanim who threw the blood took it from their hands. It wasn't the koyanim who did the zrika. They took it from the hands, not from the zrika the hailacha. It wasn't the koyanim who did the hailacha. The koyanim took it from the hands of the zor. How are you going to explain that? Answers the Gemara, it's true that after the shlita and after the Kabbalah, the Kohen did the Kabbalah Saddam, the blood was given to a Zor. But not that the Zor took it to the Kohanim next to the Mizbeach, v'yizruku HaKohanim miyodom. No. What it means is, they just stood there, just like a platform, like a stand. The blood was given to the Zor, and the Zor did not do any motion bringing the blood closer to the Mizbeach. A Kohen then took that blood from that still position and took the blood from him and did the Zrika on the Mizbeach. But so that we can understand the Pasuk without the Pasuk meaning that the Zor actually brought the blood towards the Mizbeach, so you don't have a proof from this Pasuk that a Zor can do Hoilacha. And in Yitzchok in the next Shiur, we're going to continue the next question of Rav Papa from here.